The Johnsons were hopeful when they arrived at the old towering house nestled at the edge of town. It was the dream home they had always imagined, but never thought they could afford. Mark and Sarah were beaming, their young daughter Emily less so. She stood quietly clutching her mother's hand, her small face tense as she gazed up at the house with wide, uncertain eyes. "Isn't it amazing?" Mark asked, giving Sarah a quick kiss on the cheek. "A huge yard, plenty of space, and it's ours." Sarah smiled, her heart swelling with the promise of a new beginning. "It's perfect," she agreed, squeezing his hand. "And just look at that view." She turned Emily toward the rolling hills visible from their front yard, hoping the beauty of it might calm her daughter's nerves. But Emily only stared up at the house, her face unreadable. "I don't like it," she whispered, clinging to Sarah's side. Sarah laughed gently, brushing back Emily's hair. "It's just new, sweetheart. New things take some getting used to, right?" Emily didn't respond, her gaze lingering on one of the windows on the upper floor. It was open just a crack, and although no one was there, she felt as if someone or something were watching. The first day passed uneventfully as they unpacked, their voices and laughter filling the house with new energy. Mark hauled in boxes, and Sarah busied herself arranging the kitchen, organizing shelves, and filling cabinets. It was almost as if the house itself breathed a sigh of relief, warmed by their presence. But Emily was different. She wandered through the halls cautiously, her eyes darting around as if she expected something to jump out from the shadows. She refused to go upstairs alone, and every now and then she would glance back at a corner or an empty doorway as if watching for something to appear. That night, as the family settled into bed, the silence of the house became palpable. Every creak and groan seemed amplified, echoing through the empty rooms. Sarah lay awake, her heart racing for no reason she could name. The house was old, that was all. It was bound to make sounds. Around midnight, just as she was beginning to drift off, she heard it, a soft sound, almost like footsteps coming from the hallway outside their bedroom. She sat up, glancing at Mark, who was already fast asleep. The footsteps were faint, delicate, the patter of small feet. Her mind leaped to Emily, and she rose, padding quietly down the hall. She opened Emily's door slowly, peering inside, but found her daughter fast asleep, her breathing deep and steady. Sarah shook her head, chiding herself. It was an old house with creaky floors, nothing more. But as she turned to leave, she heard Emily's quiet whisper behind her. "Mommy." Sarah's heart skipped a beat as she turned back, expecting to see Emily awake. But her daughter was still lying on her side, eyes closed, her hand clutching the edge of the blanket. "Yes, sweetheart," she whispered, edging closer. Emily stirred slightly, her voice barely audible. "She's watching us, Mommy." Sarah froze, a chill creeping up her spine. "Who's watching us, honey?" Emily didn't respond, her breathing deepening as she slipped back into sleep. Sarah felt a shiver as she looked around the dim room, feeling a strange, heavy presence in the air, as if someone were there, hovering just out of sight. She tried to shake it off, chalking it up to fatigue, and made her way back to bed. But the words lingered in her mind long after she lay down, and sleep did not come easily. The next morning, Sarah woke to find Emily sitting at the kitchen table, her face pale, her eyes distant. She looked tired, dark circles under her eyes, as if she hadn't slept at all. "Are you okay, Em?" Sarah asked, sitting beside her and gently brushing her hair back. Emily nodded, her gaze drifting to the window. "I heard her again last night." Sarah tried to keep her tone light. "You mean your imaginary friend?" she teased. But Emily's face remained serious, her eyes wide. "She's not imaginary, she's real." A strange tension hung in the air, and Sarah felt a flicker of unease. She glanced over at Mark, who was pouring himself coffee, oblivious to the exchange. "She says she used to live here," Emily continued, her voice barely a whisper. Sarah tried to smile, but her stomach tightened. "And what else does she say?" Emily hesitated, her gaze shifting to the floor. "She says she doesn't like when we're all together. She wants me to be alone." A chill ran down Sarah's spine. She knew it was probably just Emily's imagination, but the intensity in her daughter's voice was unnerving. "Listen, sweetheart," she said gently. "If anything scares you, you can tell Mommy, okay?" Emily nodded, but her expression remained serious. "She doesn't like it when I tell you." Over the next few days, things only grew stranger. The house seemed to take on a life of its own, doors opening and closing on their own, lights flickering despite brand new bulbs, and small items disappearing from where they'd been left. One evening, Sarah was in the kitchen when she heard a soft humming, a child's voice, lilting and tuneless. She stopped, her heart pounding as she tried to place the sound. Emily was upstairs, and Mark was in the garage, unpacking boxes. She stepped toward the sound, her skin prickling. "Emily?" she called softly. The humming stopped abruptly, and the silence that followed was thick, almost suffocating. Sarah's hands shook as she backed away, forcing herself to breathe. That night, as she lay in bed, she whispered to Mark, "Do you think there could be something here?" Mark chuckled, brushing it off. "It's just an old house, Sarah. Old houses creak. They have character." But as he drifted back to sleep, Sarah lay awake, feeling the heavy weight of the house pressing down on her, as if it were listening, waiting. A week into their stay, Sarah noticed that the basement door, which they kept locked, was often found ajar. She would close it, lock it, only to find it open again the next day. It became a ritual, locking it again and again, but somehow it always found a way to swing open. One night Sarah woke to a strange sound, a low, scraping noise coming from downstairs. She slipped out of bed, her heart pounding as she crept toward the staircase. The house was dark, the silence so deep it seemed to absorb every sound. As she reached the bottom of the stairs, she froze. The basement door was wide open, swinging gently on its hinges. Cold air wafted up from below, carrying a faint, sickly sweet scent, like old flowers. Sarah stepped back, every instinct screaming for her to turn around and go back to bed. But she couldn't resist. She took a tentative step forward, peering into the darkness below. That's when she saw it. A faint, flickering light at the bottom of the stairs just for a second before it vanished. The next morning she told Mark about it, her voice trembling, but he only shook his head, laughing it off. "Maybe we've got a draft," he said, though there was no real humor in his voice, but deep down Sarah knew it was more than that. Something in the house was trying to reach them, and she feared it wouldn't stop until it got what it wanted. It was the middle of the week when things began to get truly unsettling. Emily's behavior became even more peculiar. She spent hours alone in her room, talking to someone, laughing softly to herself. Sarah would occasionally peek in to check on her, but Emily would always stop and turn toward her, a blank look in her eyes as if she'd been caught doing something she shouldn't. One morning, as Sarah was folding laundry in the living room, Emily came down the stairs with a strange smile on her face. It was the kind of smile Sarah had seen in pictures of children playing hide-and-seek, half excited, half secretive. "Good morning, sweetie," Sarah said with a forced smile. "Did you sleep well?" Emily nodded, but there was something different in her eyes. "She came back last night," she said quietly. Sarah froze, her heart beginning to race. "Who, sweetheart?" "Lila," Emily said, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Lila. The name from the journal she'd found. She remembered the previous owners, the tragic story of their missing daughter, the little girl who had disappeared after her mother's death, left alone in the house by her increasingly paranoid father. And now Emily, just a child, was speaking to her as though she were a friend. Sarah tried to keep her voice calm. "Tell me about Lila, honey. What does she say?" Emily's face darkened. "She says she wants to play with me," Emily whispered, glancing over her shoulder, as if Lila were there in the room with them. "What else does she say?" Sarah's voice trembled despite her best efforts. "She says you can't stop her from coming to see me," Emily continued, her eyes growing wide. "She wants to be my friend. And she says I have to go with her." Sarah's heart began to pound, the unease in her chest turning into something heavier, more urgent. She tried to maintain control to reassure Emily, but the way Emily spoke was chilling, as if Lila were pulling the strings, guiding her every word. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible had happened to Lila, and that it was still connected to the house. Later that night, she began to comb through the old papers and notes in the attic, desperate to find more clues. She found receipts from the house's previous owners, old bills that had never been paid, and a collection of photographs. But among them, tucked in the back of a box, was something far darker: Lila's old worn journal. The journal was filled with disturbing entries, pages upon pages written by a young girl who had grown increasingly fearful. She spoke of whispers in the walls, shadows lurking in the corners of her room, and a growing feeling of being trapped. The final entry was scrawled in a shaky hand. "They say I'm bad. I don't want to be bad. Please let me out, please help me." Sarah's stomach twisted. She realized then that Lila hadn't just been playing in the house. She had been held captive, isolated and alone. There was a terrifying desperation in the journal's words, and it became clear that something, or someone, had kept Lila in the house for far too long, possibly after her death. Sarah's hands trembled as she leafed through the journal. There, at the very end, was a page that chilled her to the bone. It was an image of a small girl, Lila no doubt, standing in the center of a circle drawn in chalk, a symbol she recognized. The same symbol she had seen drawn on the walls in Emily's room. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed from downstairs, followed by the unmistakable sound of a door slamming open. Sarah dropped the journal and rushed to the staircase, her pulse racing. Sarah reached the bottom of the stairs and found the basement door wide open. She stood frozen for a moment, the sense of dread overwhelming her. Emily had been acting strangely, but this? This felt like something more. Taking a deep breath, she descended into the basement. The cold air hit her instantly, making her shiver. The flickering light overhead cast long shadows across the stone walls, and the room smelled damp and old. She moved slowly, trying to gather her thoughts. What had she hoped to find down here? Was there more to the story of Lila? Was Emily's connection to this ghost something that could be severed? Or was it already too late? Then she saw it. A hidden door, barely visible in the dim light. It was tucked behind a pile of old boxes, its edges worn and cracked. Sarah's breath hitched as she reached out to open it. It creaked on its hinges, revealing a small, dusty room, a forgotten part of the house that had been sealed off. Inside there were remnants of a child's life, old toys, a bed frame, and a dusty, broken doll. But the most disturbing thing was the chalk circle on the floor, the same one from the journal, and in the center of it, a faded drawing of a girl, Lila. The walls of the room were lined with strange symbols, symbols that had been carved into the walls, covered in years of dust and cobwebs. As Sarah knelt to examine them, she felt the weight of something unseen pressing down on her. It was as if the house itself was watching, waiting for something. As she studied the symbols, a voice whispered in her ear, so faint it was almost inaudible, "You're too late." Sarah couldn't sleep that night. Every creak of the house seemed amplified. Every shadow felt alive. Emily had fallen asleep hours ago, but Sarah could hear her soft murmurs in the dark, almost as if she were speaking to someone. A faint light flickered beneath her door. She rose, her heart pounding, and slowly opened it. What she saw made her blood run cold. Emily was standing in the hallway, her small figure bathed in pale moonlight. Her eyes were wide open, but there was no recognition in them, only a blank, unseeing stare. "Emily," Sarah whispered, but her daughter didn't respond. She simply turned, as if guided by an invisible force, and began walking down the hall. "Sweetheart, where are you going?" Sarah asked, panic rising in her chest. She reached out, but Emily pulled away, her tiny voice now eerily calm. "She's waiting for me." "Who?" Sarah's voice trembled. "Lila." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She rushed forward, trying to catch Emily, but as she did, Emily turned and smiled. This smile was not her own. It was a twisted, hollow version of it. Her eyes were no longer filled with fear or innocence, but with something darker. Lila says I have to go with her now, forever. In that moment, Sarah realized with horrifying clarity, Emily wasn't just playing with Lila. Lila had claimed her. And now the house wanted more. As Sarah rushed toward Emily, the house seemed to close in around her. Doors slammed shut and the air grew colder, suffocating. She grabbed Emily and pulled her into her arms, holding her tightly as the whispers grew louder, surrounding them. "Lila, please," Sarah pleaded. "Let her go. She's just a child." But there was no response. Instead, the air grew thick, and a shadowy figure began to materialize at the far end of the hallway. It was Lila, or rather, the twisted version of her. Her eyes black as coal, her mouth twisted in a silent scream. She reached out toward Emily. "Help me, Mommy," Emily whispered, her voice barely a cry, her body trembling in Sarah's arms. With all the strength she could muster, Sarah yelled out a final plea. "You can't have her. Leave my family alone." The house seemed to groan as if it were alive, the walls shaking violently. But then, just as quickly, it stopped. The whispering faded, and the shadows withdrew. Emily fell into Sarah's arms, her small body trembling but alive. The presence was gone. The next morning, the house felt strangely quiet, empty. Sarah and Mark decided to leave. They couldn't stay in that house any longer. The haunting, the shadows, the ghost of Lila, it had all taken its toll. As they packed their things, Emily came to Sarah, holding a small tattered doll she'd found in the attic. It was old, its features faded and worn, but the doll had a name stitched into its torn dress. Lila. "We have to go, Mommy," Emily whispered, holding the doll close. "She's still here." Sarah nodded, feeling the weight of the past pressing down on her. But this time, it wasn't the house that would keep them trapped. It was the memory of it, the spirits they had confronted, and the lingering terror of what they had left behind. As they drove away, the house receded into the distance, but Sarah could still feel its presence watching them. And in the rearview mirror, she thought she saw something move in one of the upper windows, just for a second. The drive was long, but the further they got from the house, the more the oppressive feeling seemed to lift. Emily had fallen into a quiet sleep in the back seat, clutching the ragged doll to her chest. Sarah, however, couldn't shake the feeling that something was still with them, somewhere just beyond the horizon. She glanced nervously into the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the silhouette of the house still looming in the distance. Mark seemed less affected by the whole ordeal, his focus on the road ahead, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "We're leaving all that behind," he said, trying to reassure her. "We're free of it now." But Sarah wasn't so sure. The house had felt like it had a life of its own, and the memories of Lila, of Emily's desperate whispers, still echoed in her mind. She glanced at Emily again, the girl so small and fragile in the back seat, and a knot formed in Sarah's stomach. Would they ever really escape it? They arrived at a small, safe hotel miles away from Black Hollow, tucked away in a quiet town that seemed worlds apart from the terror they had left behind. It was peaceful, almost idyllic, the kind of place where time seemed to slow down. Emily woke up as they checked in, blinking and rubbing her eyes, but she still clung to the doll. "Mommy, Lila says she's cold," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. Sarah froze. Her heart skipped a beat. "Emily," Sarah began softly, trying to suppress the rising panic. "What do you mean?" "She's in the doll," Emily said simply, her gaze locked on the small figure. "She wants to come with us. She says we can't leave her behind." Sarah's hands shook as she reached out, gently taking the doll from Emily's hands. Her fingers brushed the fabric of the doll's dress, and a wave of cold washed over her. The air in the hotel room felt suddenly frigid. She pulled her hand back quickly, trying to ignore the growing sense of unease. "Emily," Sarah said, her voice trembling, "we don't need this doll. We don't need her, all right?" But Emily only shook her head, her eyes wide with something that wasn't fear, but a deep, unsettling understanding. "Lila's still here, Mommy. She's never going away. Sarah turned away, taking a deep breath to steady herself. She felt a surge of emotion, guilt, anger, and fear, all rolled into one. The house, the spirits, it was all too much to comprehend. But what if Lila wasn't just a ghost from the house? What if she was something more? That night the house didn't feel like a sanctuary. Sarah couldn't sleep. Her thoughts kept returning to the doll, to Lila. She had tried to bury the past, but the whispers kept creeping back into her mind. The house had been part of them for so long. How could they ever fully escape it? Was there something left unfinished? Suddenly she heard it, a faint sound coming from behind the walls, as though someone was scratching, lightly tapping. It was subtle at first, but the noise grew louder, more persistent. Her breath caught in her throat. "Mark?" she whispered urgently, shaking her husband awake. "Do you hear that?" Mark stirred, groggily opening his eyes. "What is it?" he asked, irritated by the interruption. "Listen," Sarah pressed. "It's coming from the walls." He frowned, but after a few seconds his eyes widened. The sound was unmistakable, a soft, rhythmic tapping, as if something was trying to get through. "It's just the pipes," Mark said dismissively, but his voice lacked conviction. He rubbed his eyes. "It's nothing, Sarah. Go back to sleep." But Sarah couldn't shake it. She slowly got out of bed and went to the wall, pressing her ear against it. The sound was louder now, almost frantic. She turned back to look at Emily, who was still sleeping, the doll now lying at her side. The whispers seemed to grow louder, almost inaudible words slipping between the walls, reaching her ears. Suddenly the room temperature dropped. Sarah felt the cold on her skin, her breath turning to mist in the air. The whispers, clearer now, sent chills down her spine. "Sarah, Sarah, come back to me." The voice was faint, but unmistakable. It was Lila's voice. "Mark!" she screamed. But when she turned to look, Mark was gone. He had vanished, as if swallowed by the very walls. Panic surged in Sarah's chest. Mark, her husband, was gone, and Emily was still asleep, unaware of the chaos. The whispers continued, growing louder, more insistent, until they became a deafening roar. It was as if the house itself was alive, breathing, calling, reaching for her. Grabbing Emily in a frantic daze, Sarah rushed out of the hotel room. The building seemed to stretch on endlessly, the hallways growing longer, and the walls closing in. Every corner she turned, the darkness deepened and the air grew heavier. She couldn't escape. The voices, Lila's voice, followed her, chasing her down the endless halls. Finally, Sarah couldn't take it any longer. She had to go back. Back to Black Hollow. Back to the house where it all began. The only way to free herself and her family was to confront the source of the terror. She drove through the night, with Emily clutched tightly in the back seat. The road stretched out in front of them, the dark, endless night wrapping them in its cold embrace. The familiar, eerie glow of the abandoned house came into view, its windows dark, its presence as unsettling as it had been the first time. The house stood before them, tall and imposing, as if it had been waiting for their return. Sarah could feel the air grow thick, as if the house itself recognized her presence. She knew what she had to do. This wasn't just about the ghost of Lila. It was about breaking the cycle, putting an end to the suffering the house had caused for so long. Taking Emily's hand, she stepped inside. The house was silent now, almost too quiet, but Sarah could feel the pulse of energy beneath the floorboards, the whispers in the walls. She made her way through the hallway, every step growing heavier, until she reached the basement door. It stood ajar, waiting. Inside, the room was the same as before, the chalk circle still drawn on the floor. The doll sat in the center just as Sarah had left it. But something was different now. Darker. The air was colder, and the shadows seemed to twist unnaturally. And then, Lila appeared. Her face was no longer the sad, frightened face of a little girl, but a twisted, angry figure, her eyes hollow, her mouth stretched into a grimace. "I've been waiting for you, Sarah," Lila whispered, her voice full of rage and sorrow. "You can't leave. You're mine now." Emily, who had been silent up until now, stepped forward, her eyes empty. "She's right, Mommy," Emily said, her voice echoing Lila's. "I have to stay with her." With a surge of courage, Sarah stepped forward, pulling Emily back. "No!" she cried. "You are my daughter. You belong with me, not her." The room trembled, the walls shaking violently. The whispers became a roar, deafening and overwhelming. But Sarah held on to Emily, her love for her daughter strong and unwavering. She grabbed the doll and threw it into the circle, whispering the words she had read in Lila's journal. "I release you." The room went silent. The shadows withdrew, and Lila's figure faded, her cries echoing as she vanished into nothingness. As the first rays of dawn broke over Black Hollow, Sarah and Emily stood in the now empty basement. The house was still, silent, and for the first time, Sarah felt the oppressive weight lift. Lila was gone. Mark reappeared by the door, his face pale, his eyes wide with confusion. "What happened?" he asked, his voice trembling. Sarah didn't answer right away. She just hugged Emily tightly, feeling the warmth of her daughter's body against her. She had won. They had won. But as they left the house, Sarah couldn't help but glance back just once. In the window she thought she saw a shadow flicker, too quick to be sure. Lila's spirit may have been freed, but Sarah would never forget the house and the darkness that lingered there. The months that followed their departure from Black Hollow were supposed to be a fresh start. They moved into a new home, far away from the memories of the haunted house. On the surface, things seemed normal again. Emily, once withdrawn and terrified, began to smile again. She played outside with other children, laughing and running in ways that reminded Sarah of her old, carefree self. But despite their new life, Sarah could never shake the feeling that something was still watching them. It started with the mirrors. At first it was just the occasional flicker, something moving in the reflection when there was no one there, but it quickly escalated. One evening, as Sarah was getting ready for bed, she looked into the bathroom mirror and saw Emily standing behind her. "Emily?" she asked, turning around quickly, but there was no one there. Panic surged in her chest. Her heart pounded as she checked every room of the house. Mark was in the living room reading the newspaper. Emily was sound asleep in her room. Sarah tried to convince herself it was nothing, a trick of the light perhaps. But then, a few nights later, it happened again. Emily appeared behind her in the mirror. This time she was smiling, but her smile was unsettling, twisted in a way that made Sarah's blood run cold. "Mommy, look!" Emily giggled. "Lila's here." The whispers began again. It started slowly, barely audible at first, soft murmurs that Sarah could only catch out of the corner of her mind. At night, when she was lying in bed, she could hear them. A faint, childlike voice calling her name, repeating the words Sarah had heard so many times in Black Hollow. "Come back to me." Sarah thought she was imagining it at first, her mind playing tricks on her. But the whispers persisted, growing louder each night. Emily had nightmares again, waking up screaming, crying that Lila was waiting for her. Mark dismissed it as stress, as post-traumatic stress from their time in Black Hollow, but Sarah knew better. She knew that Lila was still here, still reaching for Emily. One afternoon, Sarah couldn't take it any longer. She had to know the truth. Emily's behavior had become more erratic in the past few weeks, talking to invisible friends, withdrawing from Sarah and Mark, even drawing pictures of the house in Black Hollow, with Lila standing in the window. There were traces of the same old symbols in the drawings, the ones Sarah had seen in the basement, the ones that had once held the house together. "Emily," Sarah asked one night, her voice trembling, "do you still hear her?" Emily didn't answer at first. She just stared at the wall, her eyes wide, her body tense. Then, in a whisper, she spoke. "She says you can't stop her. She's here to stay, Mommy. She's not leaving." Sarah felt the floor beneath her feet give way. The words felt like a curse, an inescapable truth. Lila was back, and this time, she wasn't going to let them go. Desperate, Sarah decided to return to Black Hollow. She knew she couldn't escape this on her own. She needed answers, needed to know how to break the cycle. She had to confront the source of the haunting once and for all. Mark was against it, insisting they'd already dealt with it, that they needed to move on. But Sarah couldn't rest until she knew for sure that Lila's presence hadn't followed them to their new home. They drove back to the old house under the cover of night. The road seemed longer now, the landscape unfamiliar despite having once been so close. It was as if the house had somehow shifted, slipping further away from time itself, now a shadow in the distance. When they arrived, Sarah didn't wait for Mark. She rushed inside, feeling the familiar chill settle into her bones. She walked through the house, each room now more suffocating than before, as though the walls were closing in on her. Then, she heard it. The whispering. It was louder this time, clear as day, as if Lila were standing right beside her. "Come find me," the voice echoed through the house. "Come back to me, Mommy. I need you." Sarah's breath hitched. She made her way to the basement door, feeling an overwhelming pull toward it. It was almost as if the house was alive, guiding her, forcing her to confront the darkness once again. The door creaked open without her touching it, and she stepped inside. The basement was unchanged, except for one thing. In the center of the room, the chalk circle had reappeared, and inside it, the doll, Lila's doll, sat in its place, waiting. Suddenly, Sarah felt a hand on her shoulder. She spun around, but no one was there. The air was thick, oppressive, and then she heard it. Her name, clear as day, spoken from the darkness. "Sarah, come back to me." Sarah ran toward the doll, snatching it from the floor. She held it tightly in her hands, feeling its cold, lifeless weight. She screamed into the room, her voice trembling with anger and fear. "Leave us alone, Lila. You're not welcome here anymore. You don't belong to this house." The house groaned, its walls shaking violently as if in response. The whispers became screams, the air pulsing with the force of something unseen. Shadows swirled around her, twisting, contorting as they surrounded her. For a moment, Sarah felt the room close in on her, suffocating her. And then, silence. The shadows receded, and the house seemed to breathe again. The whispers died down, and the doll's presence faded from her hands. For the first time, the house felt still, empty. Sarah, exhausted and shaken, slowly made her way upstairs. Emily was sitting in the hallway, her eyes closed, her tiny hands gripping her own doll tightly. "Mommy," Emily whispered. "Lila says she's going away." Sarah knelt beside her daughter, pulling her into an embrace. She felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced in months. Perhaps for the first time, Lila was truly gone. When they left the house, Sarah didn't look back. The house that had once felt like a prison now stood empty, devoid of the presence that had haunted them for so long. But as they drove away, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something still lingered, like an echo of the past. The house had been the source of their torment, but there were still whispers in the wind, and the memories of Lila would never be fully erased. As they left Black Hollow behind, Sarah made a promise to herself, to protect Emily, to keep her safe from the dark forces that had tried to claim her, no matter what it took. And in the distance, through the rearview mirror, Sarah thought she saw something moving in the window of the house, just for a second. But when she blinked, it was gone. Months passed, and life began to return to normal for the Johnson family. They moved again, this time far from Black Hollow. But every now and then, Sarah would catch herself looking over her shoulder, half expecting to see something lurking in the shadows. And sometimes, just before falling asleep, she would hear it, the faintest whisper, a reminder of what had happened. "Come back to me." She'd always believed in ghosts and hauntings, but now she knew some spirits didn't go quietly. They lingered, and no matter how far you ran, they would always be waiting in the dark.